right, this is a lecture for Chapter 4. Now, Chapter 4 is similar to the last chapter in the regards that a lot of it doesn't have a lot to do with psychology. So we're going to be able to give this one a little bit of a pass altogether, making it so we're only doing about half of Chapter 4, and since we're only doing about half of Chapter 3, that eliminates the first test to basically 5 chapters to study instead of 6. So, yay. The reason I say this one doesn't have a whole lot to do with psychology is because the entire point of Chapter 4 is that it's the physical development in infanthood and toddlerhood. And again, this is physical development. There are a few psychological implications that I'll go ahead and get into, but a lot of it is just physical. Now, that said, I'm going to go ahead and do two things with this. First of all, say that for a lot of you, the physical development is going to be, I would highly recommend that you read it anyway, just for your own purposes. If you're going to be getting into counseling or nursing or social work or anything where you're actually going to interact with children, it is actually very useful to know some of the more physical aspects of development for your own purposes, and this is the entire reason you guys are taking the course in a lot of cases. So don't ignore that just because it might not be tested on. So I can definitely recommend that. The other thing that I'm going to do is I mentioned last week that I wanted to do a practice test. And initially I had planned to do it last Friday, but I pushed it off because I want to do it on this. There are a good 10 pages on here. What do I have here? Between page 91 and 102. So it's 11 pages that are just about the physical aspects. On the other hand, it is still decent stuff. So what I'll do is on Wednesday, I will have a practice test. It'll probably only be about 5 questions, and your normal test will be 20. But it'll at least give a good example of the types of things that I'll ask for. And they'll just be from the book, where the other stuff will be both from the book and the lecture. But and it won't be graded. It's one of these things that you can do at your leisure. It's just kind of a tool I'm trying to provide you so that you can basically just not screw up the first test. Because as a student, it's relatively easy to mess up the first test because you have no idea the kinds of things to study for. You don't know what sort of depth the professor's going to ask for, the types of things they're interested in, anything like that. So between pages 91 and 102, that's going to be what we'll be doing the test on Wednesday for. And again, it's not won't be graded. I mean, I can grade it and tell you how you did, but it won't be counted towards your final grade. Just to practice so you can get to know the things. Because Friday is the first test. And like I said, it's going to be on 6 chapters. So you don't want to mess that up. Let's see. That's all the ignored stuff. So, I'll talk about some of the things that you definitely have to know. And this will kind of segue into some of the new stuff. On page 107, there's a really good blurb. It's kind of on the end of the page about culture. And you'll notice throughout the semester, I've already talked about a lot of cultural impacts of things. This talks about the cultural impact. And you wouldn't think that a chapter about the physical development of babies would have a lot about culture. But culture impacts so many things. So they talk about the fact that in different cultures, first of all, not only are norms different. For example, in our culture, we say that a baby will walk by the time it's about 12 months old. And in another culture, they might say that a baby walks at 9 months old, because in that culture, that's when they walk. In a totally different culture, they will say that babies walk much later. They'll say maybe they walk at 16 months old, because the encouragement from the parents, the entire society, everything about that really greatly influences the children in general. That said, it's not like you can just take a child, and this is really important because we've had a lot of theories on development over the years, not just Erikson and Piaget, but there was somebody named Dr. Susan Swim, and this was in the 80s, and she had a theory called good enough parenting. And people hate the phrase right now, but what it was it was a reaction. You always have to kind of take the historical context into consideration when looking at a lot of these theories. Like I said, even Watson's behaviorism was influenced by the very biological nature of the theories that came before him. And the good enough parenting was a reaction to the super babies of the 80s. There was this theory that if you really overparented the heck out of your kids, if you were the world's perfect parents, you would have the world's perfect children. And this actually started with babies. And it was actually kind of a backwards progression because everybody wanted their kid to get in a great college. So they would then try to get them into a great prep school. But in order to get into a great prep school, you had to get into a great elementary school. And this actually went back down so far to the point where people would would be on waiting lists for years before the child was even born to get into a daycare, a prep daycare, just so that they could qualify for a prep kindergarten that would qualify for the prep elementary school and so forth, all so that they could get into Harvard. And this was just nuts in the 80s. People were really believing this stuff. And so Dr. Susan Swim came in and she started talking about good enough parenting, where the idea was as long as you provided children with a safe, loving environment where all their needs were met. And she didn't look really too deeply into needs. I mean, she wasn't talking about like emotional needs and physical needs and well, this child needs to feel independent, blah, 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 blah. We're talking about just basics. Just to be there for your child, provide them food, shelter, love, and as much opportunity as you can reasonably give them, then that was good enough, and the child will develop on their own. And while there's been a lot of critique on this, there's a lot to say for it as well. Overparenting does not do all that much good. There are limits, and this is the one advantage of us going over the physical capacities in the book. There are limits just based on what the baby. You cannot teach a baby to play Mozart. It can't happen. They do not have that physical capacity. As another scientific explanation for this, a lot of people use toilet training. They want to try to teach their child to toilet train very, very easily, very quickly. Some people try to do it very late. Some people will say, well, my child, he couldn't toilet train until he was 5. And admittedly, that is usually a fault of the parent. But in some cases, it could be a fault of the child as well if they just happen to be developmentally retarded. It's one advantage, by the way, of being a psychologist is when I use the word retarded, I have to use that word because it is clinically the most accurate word. I can't just mince words and start using politically correct language like perhaps a clinician might to try to spare his client's feelings. There's nothing inherently bad about the word retarded, and the word retarded is typically used after a statement saying exactly how the person is held back. So mentally retarded would of course mean that they're mentally they don't learn that fast. I had a daughter who was linguistically retarded. She just did not learn to speak as quickly as other children. So it's nothing insulting. It's just the terminology that's used. Whether people like it or not is irrelevant. It's the most accurate that we have, and we need accuracy. But anyway, as far as toilet training goes, they took 2 identical twins. And I know I'd mentioned that twin studies leave a lot to be desired when you just do the Texas sharpshooter fallacy. But this was actually a good scientific experiment. They took 2 identical twins, and they didn't separate them at birth, but they did try potty training them differently. One of them, for example, they tried potty training from birth. They tried all the time, always trying to potty train this child. And the other one, they did exactly what they recommend that you do. You look for signs that the child is physically ready to potty train. And if you haven't had children or haven't seen the signs in a course specifically on child development, we go over it a lot more. But for example, you'll notice that the child will not soil themselves as often. You know, you're still changing diapers, but you're only changing 4 or 5 diapers a day instead of 10. And every time they fill them up, they fill them up a lot. And basically, this means that the child has been holding their bladder. They're not, their bladder just doesn't get half full and they go ahead and release it like they did before. They're actually developing the physical muscles so that they can hold the bladder a long period of time. And this is just a sign the child is ready to potty train, so you go ahead and potty train them. So they took these 2 different kids, or very similar kids, but tried to potty train them at different times. And yet they both wound up potty training within 2 weeks of each other. And this is typically how it goes with twins. When they are physically capable of doing it, they'll do it, as long as you don't miss the signs. So there is definitely some biology in what you can and can't teach children. And that's, of course, the other advantage of knowing some of the biological stuff. It's tied into psychology, even if it's not psychology itself. Now, the next thing that I wanted to go over is, as far as science goes, I've railed against journalists in the past. I'll continue to rail against journalists in the future. One of the things that we hear is that speaking of culture in the book, after that it talked about SIDS and the fact that one of the reasons children in our culture were kind of held back by about a month. Instead of walking at 12 months, we were having babies that walked at 13 months. And this was because we were told that in order to prevent SIDS, which every parent is frightened of SIDS, it's this boogeyman that will kill your children, quite literally. And your children will just die for no reason whatsoever. And we miss the fact that there's usually a very good reason, and the true incidences of unknown infant deaths are actually relatively rare. They just label a lot of different things as SIDS. But we were told for a long time that one of the things that caused SIDS was for babies to sleep on their stomachs. And so instead, we had babies sleep on their backs, and we would not allow babies to sleep on their stomachs. As a matter of fact, in this country, for a period of between 5 and 10 years, having your baby sleep on its stomach was grounds for the state to take away your children. I know these things vary from state to state, but for example, in between 2002 and 2006, I believe, in the state of Georgia, you were able to have the state remove your children because you allowed them to sleep on their stomach. And in reality, this was actually not true. It was never true. It was never particularly even found to be true. It was just people misinterpreting what the media was saying. And it's a drawback of listening to the media instead of a scientist tell you about scientific results. And basically all we were doing was, first of all, lying on their stomach is very soothing to a baby. They really enjoy it. They sleep much better. Just like if you were to hold a baby, would the baby want to be held facing you or facing away from you? I mean, they like that. I mean, we're very front-oriented creatures. We like that comfort of something right in front of us. And it also held them back because they wouldn't move their limbs as much, and they wouldn't crawl. Being on the stomach helps the crawling instinct. It makes them want to be more mobile. So we were retarding our own children physically and developmentally by basically having this wrong information told to us about when babies should and should not be on their stomachs or on their backs. Now, the thing that I really want to stress on this is that research never showed that babies should not be on their stomachs. Okay? The scientists studying this never came to that conclusion. What did happen was that we were told by people who were not scientists that the scientists came to this conclusion. And this leads people to believe, and this is a very common belief, that you can't put too much stock into things like psychology and nutrition and all these other things that are considered soft sciences, because they're constantly changing their mind. What they think is good for you one day is going to be different from what they think is good for you the next day. And this just flat out isn't true. Most of these things aren't a drawback of the researchers, but a drawback of the people telling you about the research. And there are things now that we are still kind of in the heyday of being told wrong information. We're still being told that video games, for example, um, cause children to be violent. And it just hasn't been found to be true. Admittedly, there is one researcher that really does love to say that, and but even his evidence doesn't really support it. Um, but again, the media really latches onto this. So don't think that science always changes its mind. It's just not the case. It's only the reporting, the bad reporting, that changes its mind. There are a few noteworthy exceptions, but they're typically the exception and not the rule. You can't live your life debating science. Science is explored by people who know more about this stuff than you and I. The people, I mean, I might be an expert in social psychology and psychology of a lot of media, but I certainly don't do physiological experiments on babies. So what sort of a fool would I be to doubt the very scientists who do this sort of study? They are simply my superior when it comes to this. And that's just kind of a big mental hurdle that people have a tendency to have with psychology. So it's definitely something that you will notice. And it impacts our culture on a very large scale. Now, the last thing that I want to go over is breastfeeding. And that's because this is a really classic example of a lot of you are going to be getting into some sort of a clinical practice, and you will see this sort of thing on a very, very regular basis, where there are breastfeeding support groups, there are breastfeeding tutorials, there are lactation consultants. This is a profession, for those of you that aren't familiar with it, that consult you on how to lactate. But the fact of the matter is, this is a human instinct. People do not need to be taught how to breastfeed. You could literally put the baby near the breast at birth, and it will figure it out. Now, two things that are very important to keep in mind about this is, first of all, there is and this will definitely be on a test. It is on every single one of my tests that I ever give. There is a problem called the accessibility heuristic. This is a logical fallacy. A heuristic, by the way, is any method which you have to like, imagine that your brain is a place where you store memories. The heuristic is how you put the memory into a place. And the accessibility heuristic, or how you retrieve the memory. An accessibility heuristic is that if a memory or thought or data, or wherever you want to look at these different ideas in your brain, if it's more accessible, if it's easier to remember, then we give it more weight. So I can tell you a fact that lying on your stomach does not make a baby die of SIDS. But if you can think to yourself, but I know a baby that died of SIDS and he laid on his stomach. For some reason, your brain, it's the fault of how we're built, will give that one tiny, largely irrelevant piece of information that you know a guy who said this happened, huge weight, ignoring the fact that the scientific data is based on millions of data points. Literally millions of times more important than the memory that you have, which does not particularly affect any situation other than that one instance. And yet you will give that weight, and you will honestly often choose to disbelieve the scientific evidence that's right in front of you because of this thing that you can remember. So when I say that breastfeeding is a human instinct, somebody can often think, well, I know somebody that was very difficult for them to breastfeed. Okay, but that does not stop the fact that it's a human instinct. It has nothing to do with it, actually. That was one person. And humans are more built on statistics than they are, universal laws. So by all means, there are people that do need help. So that's the first thing to consider, is the accessibility heuristic, the tendency to give very accessible, very, very salient, sometimes emotionally ridden memories or details a lot more weight than they deserve. But in addition to that, as a psychologist, we have to understand, or anybody that really deals with other people, that other people have this accessibility heuristic. And so they've been told that breastfeeding is very difficult, that it's very inconvenient, that it has this drawback and this drawback and this drawback. And so they might need a consultant just to help them get over all the lies they've been told, quite frankly. Because they're a psychological creature just like we are. So the lactation consultant would most likely spend most of their time, for lack of a better description, unlearning all this crap that people have in their brains that they've been told that are stopping them from the very basic and natural maternal instinct of put your child near the breast and let it feed. Um, that's it. That's all I can think of right now. If, like I said, on Wednesday, I'll go ahead and make sure and put it up tomorrow. And later on today, I'll go ahead and post the topic of the week. Um, and on Wednesday, the test will start from um, midnight and go to 11:55. So all day, there will be an all-day window on Wednesday. And this is what it's going to be like every Friday as well. There will be a 24-hour window in which you can take the test. And like I said, it'll only be 5 questions. It won't necessarily be graded. It'll just be something that you can do at some point to kind of get a feel of how the tests are going to be. And if there's any questions, as usual, let me know. That's what I'm here for.